So with that, I'll hand over to Adewole.
Thank you.
Good to go.
No, thank you. Good morning, everyone. No, it's very early, so hopefully we'll get through this in 30, 40 minutes. If you've got any questions, you can either ask it at the end, or you can just put your hand up and ask it as we go through. So today, as everyone, some of our colleagues here, I do work as a consultant in Adam's team, the new business team. So that's finding opportunities where we work, try to purchase sites of landowners in order to do deals, in order to help the council meet its 4,000 affordable homes target. So we're working with, I won't say distressed developers, but developers that need that encouragement because of the very fragile nature of the development market at present. So what I've done is I've just given you a very brief overview. It's a bit about myself. We're going to talk about scheme design, so that might benefit a lot of the people that are commissioning architects right at the beginning. Talk about economic theory, comparable evidence and its importance. I'll give a very brief example and then we'll end some sort of a conclusion. If anyone's got any questions, again, feel free to ask it throughout or at the end. So a bit about myself. I am a chartered planning and development surveyor. I've been in the industry for the past 12 years, working on small to large developments. I've worked for public sector as well as private sectors. And that's just a bit about myself. I've got a master's in real estate where I've got a distinction, building surveying degree. It's not a skill I utilize, but I still have it anyway. And obviously learned quite a few things over the years. And I think a lot of the IT skills, I think it's quite generic. Everyone here knows how to use Proval, SDS, Argus, and all of the different development appraisal tools that we have available. So that's just a bit about myself. So I thought I would start off with scheme design because a lot of people have this idea that it is, you leave the architect to lead the process. And I know there may be a few architects in here, and what I'm saying is very controversial, but in reality, you should never allow an architect to lead a development process through REBA stages 0, 1 to 3. And the reason for that is they don't appreciate the economics that goes into a development. And we're going to talk about that very briefly. So in terms of design, one of the things that I said is, I've obviously clearly made the first point, which is scheme design should be led by the DMO PM, as you understand the financial constraints way better than the architects. And what that means is, I'm not saying architects are not professional, they're not skilled at design, but in terms of the wider picture of how to get a scheme viable from the beginning, you have more of an appreciation of that than others. So the key ratios we're going to be talking about very briefly is net to gross. So net to gross is if you've got a building, everything that goes around the building, up, including your circulation spaces, ground floor spaces, etc., hallways, and your units, that forms part of your gross, and your net is your apartment spaces. So that's what you can sell or rent. Now, if there's a big disparity between the two, if that goes to 60%, what that basically means is you're spending all of that money to only get 60% value. So that is probably a very important acid test that all of us need to be aware of. The next one is wall to floor ratio. So ultimately, your floor area is X and your wall ratio. So this talks about the articulation of walls, which we can talk about. I'll show some examples shortly as to why it's important to just keep that as efficient as possible, between 50 to 60%. When you start getting to 80%, it means that the architects had a field day in designing something very, very elaborate. And then in terms of homes per core, I think everyone knows the importance of that. Cores are quite expensive, but the more units you have attached to a core, the better. But other people might have a different idea, ultimately around fire safety and congested homes. But I think that for efficiency purposes, the more homes you can put on the core, the better. And then I've also put in story height. You do have some bespoke developments that go up to 4 meters, but if you can't get the value for it, you're spending more, increasing the height of a building and not getting the benefits for it. So it's just something to bear in mind. And then the final point, which is a key ratio, is the apartment size versus the space standards. Now, in affordable housing, unfortunately, providing bigger units doesn't naturally get you more money or benefit you in any way, except if you have a person with a specific need. So what I mean by that is, in the private sector, you find people that say, all right, we want to maximize the value of this unit or this unit, so we need to increase the floor area, but they can ultimately use that to sell and get more money. Whereas in the public sector, if you have a bigger unit, it's not going to change the amount of rent you get. And what I'm talking about is social rent, London living rent, and some of the other tenures. your rent is what you're going to get. So if you do a big 2-bed, if you do a 100 square meter 2-bed, you're only going to get a specific rate. So give you an example, 1-bed 1-person is 39 square meters and a 1-bed 2-person is 51 square meters. According to all of the metrics that we use, you get the exact same rent. So you can ultimately see the difference between a 1-bed 1 and a 1-bed 2. So the third point I wanted to mention, which is quite important, is I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to work with builders over the years. I'm sure a lot of you have. Now, the reason why I wanted to raise this point is when you look at the way commercial teams and builders, their QSs and everyone else looks at design, you should ultimately use the opportunity to see how they see it. Because ultimately what they're looking for is efficiencies. They're trying to make sure that they are delivering schemes at a value that makes them money. So if we can have that same mindset at the beginning of our projects, ultimately that means that hopefully when we transition our projects over to the builders, they can see that there's consistency in thinking. And that ultimately, hopefully, will help you get you a more reasonable build cost. So what I've mentioned as fourth point is around the metrics that we've spoken about. What I used to have is, I used to have an Excel spreadsheet. I'll ask the architect to provide me with the accommodation schedule and all of these ratios, and I'll just check through it at the REBA stages. So REBA stages 1, 2, 3. If there's any issues, I'll get them to correct it before we move on to the next stage. And I think that is all within your control as professionals. And as I always say, always focus on what matters. You know, for renters schemes, a larger 2-bed is not going to get you more rent. So I think it's just something to bear in mind, just from a general design point of view. Now, you can't really see this clearly, but I think this just talks about the block arrangements. And from my perspective, before, the net to gross that was quite efficient was 80%. But with the secondary stair, I reckon that's probably more like, does anyone want to hazard a guess of what is appropriate in terms of net to gross if you're incorporating a secondary stair? 76. I've seen 70 at times. So anywhere between 70 to 76, I think that you probably are delivering an efficient. So I think that an efficient scheme. So I think in the next few months and years, we will start seeing what that new efficiency looks like, because an additional stair means you're taking more floor area from the ground floors upwards. So this here just shows the different types of design that you can ultimately utilize to get a sensible net to gross. I would say the one at the bottom right, which you can see the core at the outside, and then you've got like a deck access. You should avoid it at all costs. Avoid deck access. And the reason people say that is because I've spoken to various builders, and I'm sure you all have. Has anyone got any opinions on that?
No, we just went through this one.
Because one of the things that's quite important that I'm sure some of us would have experienced is deck access. When some people were assessing the gross internal area to calculate your build cost, they exclude the deck access. But if you include the deck access, you're then losing, if you can look at it here, say 78% or 73% net to gross. So that means ultimately 26% value is lost because of the net to gross. So I think that could be a problem. So I think being aware of how design impacts value and costs, I think that is very important to note. Now we're just going to move on to design, the second point, and this is more looking at the different block arrangements for the type of schemes that you've been working on. So if you look at the one to your right, which is 5A, I'm sorry for everyone that can't see it, you would immediately see that the net to gross is 79% and the water flow ratio is 0.59. So that is considered a relatively efficient scheme. Whereas when you look at block arrangement 4A, you can see the water flow ratio 0.69 and then the net to growth is 80%. And you can see the main reason between the water flow ratio is the articulation in the blocks. So sometimes you always have to look at, so I would recommend everyone to go to look at a tier 1 developers housing scheme, so Acton Gardens, and there's various around Ealing, and look at their design. You will see that there probably isn't much articulation. The only expression you generally see is elaborate facades. And the reason for that is that they can build cheaply, not cheaply, but more cost effectively than what we would do in the public sector. And what I found with a lot of architects, I think in terms of some of the more beautiful schemes, in my personal opinion, I reckon the public sector arguably deliver more beautiful schemes. And that is because we're not controlling what's happening at the beginning. And what generally happens is we have to foot the bill with it, and then we're paying it back over a 50-year period due to the discounted cash flows, which we'll talk about shortly. So I think...
Adewole, can you just explain to everyone what you mean by articulation?
Articulation. So, sorry, I'm not going to climb on the table, by the way. So if you look at 4B, you can see that the block...
Fourth down left, it's pretty easy to say it's the third down left.
Yeah, so it's the fourth down on the left. Fourth down on the left. If you look at that particular building, you can see that the water flow ratio is 0.72. And that is because the articulation I'm talking about is that it's not a complete square. So there's all different types of shapes that make that particular block. Now, there is a balance in terms of good design and what the living quality is, and more to do with, I think that you got double aspects and etc. I think that's quite important, that you have to have a bit of articulation, but too much of it means that you're paying more for it. So that's why I would say Block 5A probably is a very bland building, which I can appreciate. 4B, so you can potentially look at a scheme that's between the fourth down to your left and the upper one, 5A, which is the one right at the top, right? So that just shows some of the stuff that you have direct control over when you're drafting your briefs to your architects or working with architects and commissioning them to do work for you. So in terms of economic theory, some of the key points, this talks about, and excuse, I don't know what the hell has happened with this, but I'm not sure what's happened here. It's not meant to be redacted because it wasn't copied and pasted this way because I did it on Excel. So this just basically shows the green one right at the top shows the general house building over the past 20 years. So you can see in 1978, we've probably never achieved 300,000 homes until, I think after the Second World War is probably when they had the highest spike in house building. But if you look now, 1978 is the highest we've ever achieved, which is 250. The closest ever year is obviously 10 years later. And more recently, I think we had a recent spike in around 2000, right at the end. Now, does anyone want to guess which one the local authority line colour is?
Blue?
One below blue.
Yeah, below.
Yeah, exactly. So there was once upon a time, as you can see, the one below blue, that's the third one down. That particular line trend shows that at a time, we were one of the largest house builders. And then the one in purple is obviously the private sector. So the private sector ultimately delivers the most amount of homes in the UK. At a point, it was then the housing association, and then housing association. No, sorry. First was private developer, then it was local authority, and then it was housing association. But you can see now we have literally just stagnated. Right at the bottom, as you can see in blue, the private sector's obviously consistently delivered the most amount of housing, and then housing associations are, I won't say a good second, but they're trying their best to keep up with the private sector. So that just effectively just shows you the impact of supply. Now you can imagine if you look at 1978, if we're saying that we needed 300,000 homes a year from 1978, every single year there's someone turning 18. Every single year there's someone having the desire to move houses, whether it's through rented or to purchase. There has been an undersupply of housing for the past, if you were to really realistically look at this particular slide, I would say for the past 30 years, 40 years, or even beyond, there's been an undersupply of housing. So that then has a massive impact as to the work we do, housing registers, and all the stuff that we know is quite important.
Could you elaborate on why do you think were some of those reasons why it's gone down so dramatically?
Is there any planets in the room?
Or anyone else in the room?
Anyone else? No, I think it could be for many reasons. I think one of the reasons is obviously planning. It's not the reason, but it's part of the issues. I would also say resources as well, and there's also demand. There is a demand, but if you think about the reality, in that whole period, interest rates have obviously risen. So that means people may not be able to engage in the market, and we may not have had the skills to be able to deliver that quantum of housing. So there's so many different variables that could impact that. But more recently, I think obviously COVID happened, see 220, that went completely down. But in my view, I think that is a mixture of circumstances that cause housing supplies and completions. And we're now going to move very briefly onto demand. And then I've got some supply and demand side economics that we'll speak about. So in terms of demand, in private housing, transactions and gross lending show how much housing is in demand. More recently, you might have seen that the interest rates have effectively slowed down the transactions within the UK, and hopefully they reduce it and then people can afford to buy again. In public housing, or what we deliver in social housing, housing registers and property values do have an impact. And then all of the different types of housing, population increases, life expectancy, because people are living longer, so that means people are staying in houses for longer. Single households are effectively increasing demand on housing. Now, this just shows a supply and demand economics, and I'll just explain this as briefly as I physically can. So we've got the first point, which is talking about supply. Now, supply is effectively all the stuff that we need to do to supply the market. I'm not sure why that went off. Oh, does anyone know what that is?
Someone put another 50p in the leverage.
Where's the PR on there? Is that it? Oh,
Sometimes they put them
Maybe
outside
it's
the room.
it is.
Just keep walking, Adewole.
Yeah, no. All right. So just very briefly talking about supply, I won't explain that to everyone because I think everyone will be aware of what supply means. But supply is effectively just feeding a demand. So all the stuff that you need to feed the demand. Some of the things that I think are quite important on the supply side is planning policy. So if you've got more relaxed planning policies, generally speaking, that should hopefully translate into more homes. You've seen it used in Canary Wharf. They had very special powers. You've seen it used in Stratford. You've seen it used in, is it OPDC, the Old Oak Common. Those specific powers enable you to do tremendous and amazing things, in my opinion. And then you've also seen it used where the GLA offices are in, where is it, in East London, where Newham is. They've got yeah, exactly, LLDC. So there's so many different avenues where you can utilize specific development powers or planning powers to encourage housing in delivering housing zones, etc. Now, grant funding, yeah, over to you.
What about the impact of land banking on supply? So you've got kind of public sector factors, but isn't there an incentive for developers to actually only produce a certain amount of supply to keep prices high?
We'll walk this way now. I'm gonna walk this. Yeah, all right. So in answer to your question, land banking is a very political topic that we can delve into now. So I think there's two elements. If you buy a piece of land for an X amount of money, there needs to be an economic case that would enable you to release that land. Now, if matters do not allow you to release that land because of the economic situation, a person's not going to release that land, are they? So if I said to you, you bought something for £10 with the view that you're going to make £50 and you borrowed £10 as an example, and then I'm incentivizing you to release it for £11, you may say, I anticipate making £20 of it, so I'm going to wait until I can make my £20. So I think land banking is always an economic case, but also some of the biggest land banks in the UK are owned by the private sector in some cases. There are stringent planning policies, greenbelt land as a first point. There are restrictions as to what they can do with that land, and it takes 10 to 15 years for a developer to promote a land or greenbelt piece of land through planning. So I think it's a very complicated area. I know some people hold on to it to wait out to see how much money they can make. It's always an economic case, but also some of the biggest land banks in the UK are owned by the private sector in some cases. There are stringent planning policies, greenbelt land as a first point. There are restrictions as to what they can do with that land, and it takes 10 to 15 years for a developer to promote a land or greenbelt piece of land through planning. So I think it's a very complicated area. I know some people hold on to it to wait out to see how much money they can make on it, but I don't think it's like a notorious means.
I've let it go twice now. I let go once, but I can't let go twice.
Yes.
I am responsible for the local plan and planning
Yes.
policy, and I'm afraid you sort of trial some sort of general sort of arguments that the planning system is broken and it's not the housing market that actually is the issue.
Yeah.
Your argument seems to suggest, firstly, we're not producing enough supply. The fact of the matter is that the planning system is delivering record numbers of planning consents, and has been now for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Significantly more than 90% of all planning applications are approved.
Yeah.
But of course, approvals don't necessarily feed through to completion.
Totally agree.
The other argument, I mean, I have to say, I was quite astonished by your argument using the Docklands as an example of simplified planning zones, because we're now pulling down most of what the NLDC did because it was such poor bloody quality. So isn't the issue that, you know, by putting development economics as top of the list and the only and sole priority, that's going to be at the expense of design and housing quality? We'll only then be building the slums of tomorrow. And I particularly reference that in context with the agenda around climate change and climate action, where again, planners are often accused now of adding, loading extra cost in terms of energy efficiency and so forth.
Yeah.
But I would argue, if we're going to save the planet, that's absolutely bloody essential, isn't it?
Yes. So, I'm going to respond to you after that. Please go ahead.
I know, so I just want to ask, so in terms of the supply and demand, have you ever looked at how many homes get put into the market by small-scale developers versus large-scale developers? Because you mentioned Acton Gardens, and Acton Gardens have been developed over many years, and it still will continue to be developed, whereas smaller-scale developers, they get units into the market a lot quicker, potentially.
Yeah.
And then what can we do then, if that's the case, to unlock that potential so that they can, you know, get units into the market quicker?
Interesting. So we're speaking specifically about small developers, right? Okay, so in answer to that, I'm going to answer your question very quickly, and then I'll answer your one on small developers, because I've got a personal example. So in answer to your question, I definitely agree. If you are looking at it from a purely economic point of view, you are encouraging the slums of tomorrow. So I'm not going to disagree with that. But there's always this fine balance that we all have to appreciate. And I'm not slating planners, just so you know. It's not a planning problem, it's an everyone problem. I think that there is that fine balance, which is economic as well as the wider sustainable benefits that come with development. And hopefully, by the end of this, you'll be able to see that we have to marry the two together. So it's not just an issue for planners. And I know a lot of developers, or a lot of us that work in development, like to blame planners, but it isn't a planning problem. It isn't there's various circumstances. So there's the economy is an issue. We've got sustainability, which is the regulatory matters, and we've got planning matters. So all of that together ultimately should get us into a position where all parties are, or the environment is in a better position. So I definitely agree with you. I'm not in any way slating planners, by the way. And some of those examples is only because I know that particularly on housing zones, they do try to relinquish the local authority in some ways, and then they try to encourage that, similar to what they've done in Stratford. And Stratford, I would hope, is not going to be the slum of tomorrow, because a lot of it, unfortunately, unfortunately, is for private housing. So I think that we'll hopefully keep talking about that in the questions, if that's all right. So in answer to your question, and I'm only going to use a personal example, small developers, and this is my personal opinion. I'm not talking. Please don't hit me back on it. Small developers do deliver a fraction of the market, but I found that larger developers have a greater say, because if you're going to do a planning application on a green belt, if you look at the sliding balance that they always talk about, the greater good of one house versus 1,000 houses, you can't put the two and two together. And I'll give you an example. I submitted a planning application on one of my schemes on what is Greenbelt for self-build, and unfortunately it got rejected almost immediately. When I spoke to the planning consultant as to why that was, they said, one, it's Greenbelt, which I'm very aware of that impact what I was doing. But the second point they mentioned is, in the greater scheme of things, the damage outweighs the benefits. And the damage of one house outweighs the benefits of.
Yeah, but that's very specific to the Greenbelt.
Yes.
You know, obviously that would be the outcome. But I mean, if it's not, not all small-scale developers will go to the Greenbelts. There's a lot of areas.
And I've got another example. I had one in Slough, and this one depressed me last year. So I submitted one in this perfectly good area, sensible area, and it's an appropriate development. And it got rejected for various reasons. So some of the things that I've experienced working in large-scale developments and also the public sector versus small developers, and I'm not in any way saying that I'm just talking from a personal experience. For small developers, people go into detail. That's just one of the things I've observed. Whereas if you're looking at 1,000 units, you're not going to go into specifics. You'll go into the larger arguments, but it's not going to be as challenging to get through planning because everyone needs to deliver houses. So that's just my personal experience working for myself as a small developer, as well as working for the local authority. I think it can be a bit more challenging. And the economic and the losses that we experience is quite real because it's our personal money. So it makes it very hard to get things going. But having said that,
challenge that.
But that's a macro. I'm a macro developer, but some of my small developer colleagues, they buy sites with planning permission. So I think that it's always going to be about. I do feel that small developers do contribute quite significantly, but I think it's just always around who are you competing with. So the larger developers can and have the resources to wait out planning permissions, to utilize all types of arguments to get their schemes through. However, the small developers have a limited amount of resources. So there's always that balance.
So isn't that something that can be unlocked for them, that they can actually, get more units out? I mean, don't want to take over your presentation.
No, it is.
I mean, if we could get, people to put, because I work on a couple of, I work on acting gardens and stuff like that. And I mean, I see how long it takes for, developments to actually happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, ultimately they do put a lot of units, into the market, which is really great, and the percentage is affordable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes we do underestimate the role that your smaller scale developers play within the market.
Yeah.
That's fine. I think small sites make a very valuable contribution.
Yes.
If we discount it. And I think part of your perception may well be that particularly members, when they're involved in the political process, will often be much more involved in microscopic detail on a small scheme because they can understand it. Whereas a scheme which is involving 1,000 units, it's a bit more difficult for them to comprehend. The real issue, though, isn't it, is that we've only got a handful of big volume house builders in this country.
Yeah.
And there's a raft of studies, including RICS, which support this. These house builders ration the supply to the market so they can keep prices high. And that's the reason why some of these schemes seem to be drawn out for years and years and years. And, there's an awful lot of mystique around this and dark arts of viability and how there are all these problems. But that is, I'm not excusing the fact that we have had regulatory change like the second staircase, for example, which has rendered lots of schemes now no longer viable. It's not planners' fault. That's not the applicant's fault, because government has reacted knee-jerk in response to something which happened in Kensington, and probably should have reviewed the building regulations as they promised to do for the last 10 years and haven't. Okay. But the real problem is the rationing of supply to keep prices high because they want to defend their profit margin.
There will be some, but it may not. But I don't think it's all that utilize that method, in my personal opinion. Because if you think about, so I'll give you an example. When we do our development appraisals as a public sector, we run our development appraisals and we cash flow as to how quick we can absorb the units. So that is either sell or rent. Now, if it's found that it will take a ridiculous amount of time to sell or rent those units, the ways that you can obviously sell and rent units quickly is to reduce your prices. It's as simple as that. And if you can reduce it below the market value, people will literally just be flat fighting over themselves to get to it. Now, what that comes at a consequence of viability. And then it then means that you arguably may not make any money if you're discounting your units that much. So I feel that there are some arguments where, in terms of the land banking point you mentioned, and I know you mentioned as well, I definitely agree that some people do it, but in reality, and this is just looking at the general economic points that we're briefly going to talk about, there are other factors that slow down the delivery of housing, which is the economy. So the interest rates, and I put that on the demand side. Help to Buy was probably one of the biggest stimuluses, at least in my lifetime anyway. In that people that couldn't afford to buy a specific unit, they will get the Help to Buy loan, and that helps them get onto the property market fairly quickly. That ultimately stimulates demand. Now, with that now being lost, you're starting to see that a lot of the house builders, their literally completions or sales are going down, and they're having to adjust their delivery to deal with that. So yeah, I do definitely agree that people developers are having to control the delivery of their housing because of those changes to the market. So I definitely agree. So just from a supply side, grant funding does stimulate houses. Just as you are aware, we are delivering social rented without the £240 a square, £240,000 per unit that we're getting on social rent. Social rent will not be delivered as a tenure. That is, I think that everyone can agree that that is a fact, because social rent isn't a tenure that delivers any return over 50 or 100 years. So you ultimately need grant funding for that reason. The second point in terms of supply is land, and we were talking about land release. I think you work in a planning policy team. When you get sites allocated, that ultimately, when you're doing your 5-year land supply, all of that ultimately just helps with the supply, and it gives all markets, which is public, private, housing associations, the confidence, if sites are allocated, that schemes will come forward, and it helps the local authority know when and how schemes are going to come forward in the future. And we've also put in inflation. Obviously, when we had that whole issue with the inflation issues following COVID, that had a massive impact. We were seeing inflation go up as high as 10%. So £1 today, it's £1.10 tomorrow, and then it just inflates every single moment thereafter. And that impacted a lot of the building materials. So that had an impact on supply. So that's why when I showed you this table from 2020, outside of the fact that obviously people wasn't allowed to go outside because of social restrictions, another key impact behind that was the inflation. And there was various schemes that I was working on during COVID that had to slow down as a result of some of the impacts. And in terms of demand, I think I've spoke about Help to Buy. Help to Buy is, I would say, one of the golden items that I think stimulated the housing market for various years. That was taken away, I think it was last year, I believe, 2 years ago. So you're now starting to see that private developers are literally, real salaries have not increased as high as property values. So you can imagine, if I earned £50,000, probably couldn't buy a house for 400,000 unless I had significant deposit. But with Help to Buy, you were able to do it. Now, with something that Help to Buy now no longer available, I think they are having to think about either reducing prices, or hopefully the government may come out with something new that may stimulate the market. But let's wait and see. And I've also put in interest rates as a general point. Interest rates go higher, people can't afford to buy, and that has an impact on demand. And we've seen that with various house builders. A lot of house builders have revised their completions as a result of the interest rate issues. So if you look on Construction Inquirer, Property Week, you're seeing many developers revising their future growth forecast as a result of the current economic issues related to interest rates. But things are improving, so I've been told. So in terms of the two methods of evaluating developments from our perspective, I'm sure everyone here would have either done a residual appraisal or done a discounted cash flow, but I'm just going to go through this as quickly as possible. So the first point is a residual appraisal. I think a lot of us in the private sector use it to effectively establish the value of a site and the profitability at a moment in time. It's used by private developers when carrying out development appraisals. And also it's used by the local authority to determine the appropriateness of the planning contributions, whether it's Section 106s and any other contributions that developers need to bring. So if anyone doesn't know the calculation, it's your gross development value, which is how much can you sell all of the units, irrespective of tenure, minus your gross development costs, that's all of your costs, minus your land, minus your finance, equals your profit. So that's one method of doing a residual appraisal. And then the second output you can do is just change land for profit, which is generally around 20% of your GDV, and that gets you your land value. So if anyone has any means of needing to calculate the profitability of a project, that is a way that you can do it. Now, in terms of discounted cash flows, this is probably what we use more in the public sector when we're holding on to assets over the long term. So it's used to value the income over a period of time. It's mainly used by us in the public sector, pension funds, all long-term people that hold assets for over the long term. So that's hotel companies or PRS companies use DCFs. And this is basically the calculation. You basically use, in a nutshell, is basically your present value equals your future value, which is, if you think about a cash flow, year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, your net income is what your present value is per year, and then you do 1 plus I, your interest rate, which is effectively your discount rate, and then N. I'll show you a table of how it works in a moment, because it's not the easiest to explain without showing it on Excel. So this here just shows the residual appraisal, and I'm not going to go into it because it's not the clearest of appraisals, but you can see it's just your GDV, and it works all of your costs, and it gets you to the bottom of your profit. And as mentioned, at the bottom, you would typically expect 20% profit on GDV. If anyone wants this on Excel, happy to share it, but it just shows how development appraisal works. Now, I've got a question. Would you prefer, and this is looking at discounted cash flows, would you prefer £100,000 today or £10,000 over 13 years? Which option presents the better opportunity? 100 today? Anyone else?
100 today, I probably won't be here in 13 years.
Anyone else got any ideas? Or £10,000 over 13 years? Anyone else? All right, so I think that whoever answered 100K today for various different reasons probably is the right answer. In that, if you look at the discounted factor of the 10 grand a year, over 13 years, you're obviously getting £100,000, but then you discount that £10,000 over the years. So that 130 works out to be £96,000 in today's money. And that is effectively what gets you your net present value. So your net present value, if anyone asks you what that means, it's just a sum of your total net cash flow discounted on a year-by-year basis over the total period. So in this example, 13 years, 96.8. So hopefully that will help you understand your Probar appraisals a bit better. If you want to understand it, you can just download your Probar Excel sheets and then work out this calculation as well. So that just gets it for your benefit. So moving on to comparable evidence, and I think quite importantly, I thought I'll just go through this very briefly. It tells you, it's basically your eyes and ears when you go out to the market to try and understand values and rental values as well. So I would definitely recommend that you follow this general process. So when looking at comparable evidence, the first one is you need to make sure that you're looking at more than one transaction. So if you're looking at a location, you've got a 1-bed, 2-person, you need to look at 1-bed, 2-persons in that particular area. And then it needs to be very similar and identical. So if you think about a penthouse in Kensington, you can't compare a penthouse on the top floor to a single unit in Canning Town, because there's 2 different markets, 2 different areas, 2 different amenities, etc. So you have to make sure it's as similar as possible. Now, in terms of recent, they generally say anywhere between 1 to 6 months is a sensible comparable item. So as recent as possible, results in an arm's length transaction. So if I bought Sanjiv's property for £1 million, but in reality it's worth £300,000, you can't use that as a comparable because it's not an arm's length transaction. So you have to use something that has effectively is an arm's length transaction between 2 parties. And the other thing is verifiable. So you can go onto land registry and you can find all of the values of any property in the UK. So that is effectively your best verifiable source, and it's consistent with the market practice. So that's what I would recommend if you are doing comparable evidence. So what I tend to do when I'm putting together comparable evidence when working on developments is I'll create an Excel spreadsheet. I would then just list out the comparable evidence, and then I'll list out distance from the property, type of property, etc. And that is effectively how I'm able to work out. And then what you're doing there is it will give you an idea of what the values or the specific values of a property in a location is. There is an RICS document that explains this in a lot more detail than what I'm explaining it, so I'm happy to share that if needed. So the other thing I'll mention is you have to drill down into the detail. So a property with a concierge generally may sell more than a normal property without a concierge. So you have to try and get very specific into what the differences as well as the similarities are. And then finally, once you've obviously gone through all of your comparable evidence in order to establish your value for the property, you have to take a step back and think whether that property will trade in this current market. So what I've done in some cases, and I've done it here whilst working at some schemes, is you will find comparable evidence and it would say it's fairly high, but then you look around the environment and say, you know what, I think that we're going to reduce it by £10 a square foot or whatever the amount is because of the general market at that particular moment in time. So in terms of conclusions, I would just say that the first point is you win or lose at the beginning of a project. And that is just a general point. If you design a scheme well and you follow some of the principles, you don't have to follow all of them, I would say, because a completely efficient scheme is probably not the most desirable scheme. That is the honest truth. There will be elements where you may have to shift and say the water flow ratio is going to be higher because the architects want, or not architects, but you want a high quality design. So I'll just say that you just need to pick what areas you want to effectively compromise on in order to get an attractive scheme where people want to live. But ultimately, you win or lose right at the beginning of the project. I've also talked about try to be aware of the economic indicators, so inflation and interest rates. Those are the two key items I would say in our current market, outside of the various points that we've spoken about, that will have an impact on our current industry over the next few years. And then be aware of the supply and demand economics in property development. So hopefully Sadiq Khan may come up with a new grant regime, and that might stimulate housing development more within the London setting and in the UK, and not his role, but Homes England may come up with a new funding regime and that would ultimately stimulate it. But I think we just need to be aware of what those economic factors are over the next few years, and then always get someone to review your appraisal. So as much as I love, I would say that I understand appraisals, it's always important to get someone else to look at it. So I will call Sanji to say, Sanji, I'm just going to send this appraisal to you. I don't want to speak to you about it. Can you just review this appraisal and give me your unadulterated opinions? And what that does is it's always important to go in twos, ultimately, because you can input something wrong, Sanji may spot it, and then, but I've had instances, not personally, where people have made quite significant mistakes. Approvals have been, things have been approved, schemes are on site, and then they're now having to unpick those issues. So I think that if you have someone and have a group of people that you can share your appraisals with just to review it, I reckon it's a very good thing to do. And then always keep an eye on the economy and new initiatives. I think I've spoken about that. And that is it.